Okay, well, the great theme of Marxism in many ways this year will be discussing and analysing the political upheaval that's hit British politics since the referendum result. Obviously, we're going to be concentrating this meeting on one aspect of that. But what's clear is that the outcome of the EU referendum has created a political storm that's hit the political edifice of British society and revealed much of it is decaying and rotting. Both main parties are deeply divided. Both the wings of the two-party system are seeing huge tensions which have been exacerbated but not caused directly by the referendum itself alone. And let's be clear, this is a moment of profound crisis. This is not just a passing moment that's going back to business as usual. This is the crystallisation of deep developments in British society. I see that the Financial Times this morning talking about how British politics is becoming more like Greece in sense of that huge sense of political upheaval and crisis. Now, what we've seen since Sunday is a concerted attempt by the majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party to drive out Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour leadership. They claim it's a purely spontaneous move, except every 2 hours somebody resigned. And thanks to the joys of the internet, you can read articles in the Daily Telegraph back in early May that talk about how Margaret Hodge would spearhead a rebellion to drive out Corbyn. The problem for the plotters is I think the plan was to break him, to force him out, to force him to resign. Not to face an election where heaven knows the members might have a view about this. That's, by the way, I mean, I've people seen the reports of the meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party on Monday night that talked about that the aim of a whole number of Labour MPs was to break Jeremy Corbyn as a man. This is vicious behaviour. And we should remember it next time they lecture the left about bullying and all the rest of it. This is a vicious attempt. But it's clear that Corbyn has stood his ground. Actually, it was fantastic that he could come out of that parliamentary meeting on Monday night and walk across into Parliament Square, where the demonstration called by Momentum had at least 5,000 people packing that square in support of Corbyn. That clearly helps in terms of stealing him. This occurs, of course, just 9 months after Corbyn won a huge mandate. We all know it, but let's just remind ourselves, 59.5% of the membership voted for Corbyn. And as speaker after speaker, Monday night's meeting in Parliament Square said that just at the moment when the Tories are ripping themselves apart, I mean, even the Leave wing is now ripping itself apart with Gove doing over Johnson. Just at this moment of crisis for the Tories, the Parliamentary Labour Party decides not to attack the Tories, but to turn on its own leader. And what's clear, and I think this is clear to everybody, people understand the stakes, that this goes far beyond just the question of the fortunes of Jeremy Corbyn. What's at stake is what kind of party the Labour Party will be. It will have far-reaching implications. Will Labour be an anti-austerity, anti-war party that also challenges racism and defends migrants? Or will it be a party that subordinates all of its social policies to, what do they like to call it, fiscal responsibility, to austerity, that accepts the military alliance between Britain and America as the basis of legitimate politics, and that is willing to make endless concessions to racism over immigration? The very soul of the Labour Party is at stake here. Secondly, it raises fundamental questions about, is Labour a democratic party? I remember when I left the Labour Party to join the SWP as a student, one of the arguments is Labour's a democratic socialist party, unlike you Leninists and so on, right? Is Labour a party in which the members decide what happens, or do at best a few hundred votes of Labour MPs ultimately outweigh what hundreds of thousands of Labour members want to do? And these two questions are, of course, related and intertwined. What happens if the majority of Labour members want a party that opposes austerity, but the MPs don't? I think what we're witnessing inside the Labour Party is the contradictions of Jeremy Corbyn's victory 9 months ago erupting. Why do I say that? Peter Mandelson, key architect with Tony Blair of the New Labour project, and a ruthless defender of capitalist politics and society in reality, but not a stupid man, was quite astute. How did he describe Corbyn's victory? He described Corbyn's victory as our Syriza moment. In other words, he rightly located it as part of a wider international phenomena of the emergence of radical anti-austerity political forces. Think of Syriza most importantly in Greece, but Podemos in the Spanish state and other examples will spring to mind. This is part of a wider trend that hit Britain last year. The paradox is that here in Britain, this didn't take the form of a party outside or a breakaway from the main Social Democratic Party. This took place inside the ossified, conservative, hollowed-out structures of the Labour Party. In fact, partly because of those hollowing out, what we saw was the mass movements, or perhaps better, the people influenced by those mass movements over the last 10, 15 years against war, against racism, against austerity, sweeping into the Labour Party and catapulting Jeremy Corbyn, a socialist, the ultimate outsider inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, into the Labour leadership. But in truth, it was only half a revolution, because the Parliamentary Party remains deeply committed to the old politics of supporting austerity and so on. Most Labour leaders historically have emerged as representatives of the Parliamentary Party, as the person they see as best placed to pursue their interests. Corbyn emerged as Labour leader as part of a rebellion against the Parliamentary Party. I mean, I thought one of the key moments in the election, Labour leadership election last year, was when I think it's 184 Labour MPs abstained on the Tory welfare bill that involved £12 billion of cuts to some of the poorest in society. It was one of those people were sick of a Labour leadership that capitulated or outright embraced these kind of attacks and so on. It was a rebellion against the Parliamentary Labour Party. But the Parliamentary Party remains dominated by what Alex Klinikos calls the political children of Tony Blair. That's the contradiction that we saw 9 months ago. And now, after 9 months of guerrilla warfare against Corbyn, they've launched their counter-strike. One of the things I think we have to explain, why do they feel they can act this way? Why does the Parliamentary Party act this way? And part of this, it's extraordinary that the battle cry of the Labour right wing for years was one member, one vote, because they saw it as a way of trying to dilute and erode the influence of the trade unions and any kind of hint of class arguments inside the Labour Party. They thought, we'll bring in a mass of passive members, more influenced by the media and so on, and they'll vote with us against the unions. That allowed them to pose as Democrats. We had to explain the complicated arguments about the nature of the Labour Party. They could just say, we believe in one person, one vote. What's the problem? Now, discovering that thousands of Labour supporters actually have left-wing views, people swept into the Labour Party to put Corbyn there, what their position now is really one MP, one vote. Which actually, that's how Labour leaders were elected until the early 1980s. It was part of the movement around Tony Benn, the Bennite reforms, after the great betrayal of the late 70s Labour government, who didn't act on their own programme to implement these reforms. They want to reverse the clock back and undo even the Benn reforms of the early 80s. The truth is, the Parliamentary Party is effectively autonomous from the rest of the Labour Party. This has deep roots. This isn't just because of the current makeup. People probably know some of the history of the Labour Party. The first great influx of Labour MPs was 1906. 29 Labour MPs were elected. Immediately that triggered a debate inside the Labour Party about who was sovereign, the Parliamentary Party, the MPs, or the conference, i.e. the members. As early as 1907, the Labour Party passed a motion declaring that the time and method, conference could pass decisions, but the time and method of their implementation would be left up to the hands of the MPs. Now, any executive knows that once you have that power to decide how something's implemented, there's an awful lot you can get away with. That tension has always been there historically inside the Labour Party, and it reflects the very nature of the Labour Party as a reformist party that looks to parliamentary change. If you look to Parliament as the key agency of social change, you elect a Labour government, implements a programme and so on. For some people that was socialism, Labour Party acting in Parliament as a government. It privileges, by its very nature, the MPs. And they see their role as not loyal to the members, but to act unilaterally. I remember the late 1980s, I think Neil Kinnock was Labour leader. There was a Labour conference was taking place. I think the Labour conference voted for unilateral nuclear disarmament. Britain would get rid of its nuclear weapons no matter what anyone else did. Quite right. Neil Kinnock came on the telly that night, on the news, and said, we're not doing that. The Labour government weren't doing it. Well, why bloody have a conference then? You know, his views outweighed that of the membership. There's a man called Joe Haynes, who was Harold Wilson's press secretary in the 1970s, when he was a Labour Prime Minister. He wrote a very influential piece in the New Statesman in January, which has had a big impact on the thinking of large parts of the Labour right in Parliament. And he said that the Parliamentary Labour Party that represents the Labour vote in Britain it's the Parliamentary Labour Party that represents the Labour vote in Britain, not the 423,000 people, including the rag bag of registered supporters, note the contempt, who voted in the leadership contest. The Parliamentary Party is the most powerful force in the Labour movement, far stronger than the total union membership. The PLP cannot be dictated to within the party by any outside bodies. If MPs decide they want to elect their own leader of the PLP, they can do so. Just disregard the attitudes of the membership. And why is the Parliamentary Party so right-wing? I mean, ordinary people join the Labour Party because they want some social change, right? The Parliamentary Party is much more moulded by the capitalist state and its interests because they aspire to pilot the ship and periodically are in office. They're much more moulded by those, even more than the trade union leaders who sometimes, for all their conservatism, have one foot in the organised working class. The Parliamentary Party much more directly reflects the interests of the capitalist state. That's why there's such a concentration of conservatism in it. Now, the battle cry of the plotters of the Labour right is Corbyn can't win. Can't win a general election. I mean, I think we all know they have two fears. One is that Corbyn can't win. The other is that Corbyn can win a general election. Now, there's probably a mix of both of that in a lot of them. My view is that there is a section of the Labour right who are deeply ideologically committed to capitalism and therefore cannot stand the idea of a left-wing Labour government. I mean, Tony Blair more or less said this a few months ago, said, even if Corbyn could win, I wouldn't support him. Right? That's what a layer of... But part of their attempt to pull a wider layer around them, they're part of their ideological armoury in their onslaught on Corbyn, is this argument that Corbyn can't win. I think this is part of why it's not just the hardcore of the Blairites, they've reached out to parts of the softer left with this argument. And it is one we will hear. Therefore, I think it's one we have to be able to address. Now, first thing to say is, I mean, you know, there could be a general election in the autumn. Attacking your own leader, saying you have no confidence and trying to depose him is not the best way to go into a general election, right? They will bear huge responsibility if Labour's defeated. When it was the Labour right and the Blairites in charge, what they used to say to the left, divided parties can't win elections. As soon as the left is on the ascendant, forget about it, open mutiny. Secondly, what's the record at the ballot box of the Labour right who is supposedly so electable? Between 1997, when Tony Blair won his first election victory, and 2010, the Labour Party lost 5 million votes. They took Labour back to barely a fraction above where it was in the historic low of 1983, which is always used as the left can't win, look what happened in 19... They took the Labour vote back to that position. They lost millions of votes. Look at Scotland. People may not... There's a man called John McTiernan, thoroughly unpleasant character. He used to be an advisor to Blair. He's the man who, during last summer's Labour leadership election, appeared on Newsnight notoriously and said that those Labour MPs who nominated Corbyn but didn't support him, lent their nomination to Corbyn to broaden the debate, he described them as morons who needed their heads felt. Right? He's a nasty, nasty character. What was his previous job? Advisor to Jim Murphy, leader of the Scottish Labour Party during the general election campaign. I mean, John Prescott, interestingly, was rude enough to tweet this, right? Where's the authority that you have? Now, it's also clear that the strategy of the Labour right to reconnect with alienated working class voters, alienated Labour voters, is particularly, I think, to make concessions over racism. That's how they read the Leave vote. These people are racist. What's the solution? Be more racist. That's their strategy. This is a complete disaster. Now, I mean, one of my fears during this meeting was that it's probably quite good there's not much of a mobile signal, because I suspect that people will be looking at their Twitter feeds and everything's changing constantly. But as of when I walked in the room and last had a signal, it looked increasingly likely that the plotters were going to have to face up to the fact there'd been an election. Now, obviously, the sensible thing from their point of view is to put up one candidate. If that's Angela Eagle, I mean, it's extraordinary. Angela Eagle voted for Iraq. By the way, she voted for rising tuition fees. She voted repeatedly to tighten laws against asylum seekers, for welfare cuts. She voted to bomb Iraq in 2014. She voted to bomb Syria in 2015. And this supposedly, their electable alternative came fourth out of 5 candidates in the deputy leadership last year, right? This is the strategy of the Labour right. I think this question, which we'll carry on debating through Marxism, about is Britain this right-wing place and so on, I think we need to take it on. If you look at the British Social Attitudes Survey, which is one of the biggest government surveys of social attitudes, it happens every year, again and again, I mean, I wrote about this in Socialist Review a couple of years ago, again and again, the picture emerges is that very large numbers of working class people still hold what you'd call a social democratic worldview. In other words, they're not revolutionary socialists, that's a much smaller minority, unfortunately. But the idea that we should renationalise the railways, we should renationalise the water companies, we should renationalise even British Telecom, that the state should intervene to curb the worst excesses of the market has a very wide resonance. One poll I saw suggested a majority of Tory voters think we should renationalise the railways. These ideas have a big purchase in society. When I woke up this morning on Radio 4, there was actually someone doing an interview about the latest British Social Attitudes Survey, which says 60% of people in Britain see themselves as working class, which was the same, by the way, same level as 1983. All this stuff about class disappearing and so on. I mean, much to the confusion of the person who was introducing the survey, saying, but that's far more than there actually are, because, we're all white-collar professionals these days, right? What was also interesting is that the number of people who think that there is a class divide in British society has gone up to 77%, and the numbers of people who think that social mobility could allow you, or maybe your children, to cross that divide is declining. People think that class is hardening in British society. So the kind of arguments that someone like Jeremy Corbyn have potentially enormous resonance. Now, of course, the picture's contradictory. And here it's so important how we understand the Leave vote. If we simply see the Leave vote as essentially a single racist reactionary bloc, it reinforces that argument that Britain is this right-wing country and left-wing ideas can't get a purchase and so on. The reality is it's much more contradictory. Of course, there's a huge sense of class bitterness in society. There's also the pull of anti-immigration ideas, which are constantly pumped out, not just in the referendum campaign, but for 30 years by the mainstream, which Labour repeatedly have made concessions to. Remember the controlling immigration mugs that they fought the election on last year. And I think the Leave vote reflected that, both a combination of a kind of roar of class bitterness, but also the influence of anti-immigration ideas. They commingle, they mix together. The key question for me is how the left responds. And it matters. It matters whether you have a Labour leadership that challenges those ideas and fights to give expression to that class bitterness towards the powerful in society rather than scapegoating the most powerless, or you have a Labour leadership that thinks the way to deal with that is to reflect those ideas, accommodate to them, and reinforce them in society, which is what we had for 20 years prior to Jeremy Corbyn. That matters. Those kind of how you stand on that ideologically makes a difference, especially if it's the Labour leadership, which gets an echo. This is what's so welcome about Corbyn's leadership, that you get an echo in the mainstream of arguments you just didn't hear. But in my view, more important even than the political arguments put by the leadership of the Labour Party and so on, is a question of the scale of collective resistance in society. All the historical evidence suggests that when working class people are acting collectively, when they feel confident, when they feel active, that they are far more resistant to ruling class ideas. When people are passive and at home, they are far more susceptible. Their barriers to those ideas are much weaker. This is why things like the strike by the teachers across schools in England is so welcome next week. I mean, it's Kevin Courtney, the leader of the NUT, was quite right to say a strike next week points the finger at the problem of overcrowding and underfunding in schools at the Tories. The absence of a strike creates a space for the argument that it's immigration. Collective struggle is what can shift a confident working class. I mean, in the middle of the miners' strike in the 1980s, when Neil Kinnock was denouncing the strike, Labour was riding high in the polls because there was a sense of class feeling in society. So the question of struggle is utterly vital in terms of influencing which direction that contradictory mass of ideas go. Now, if we want to think about the dynamic inside the Labour Party, we have to think about the trade union leaders, because in the kind of triumvirate of forces that have historically shaped the Labour Party, the parliamentary party, the trade union leaders, the trade union bureaucracy, and the members, in truth, it's been the bureaucracy and the parliamentary party that have been the dominant, with often the membership a poor third. What the trade union leaders do matters. Now, the union leaders are backing Corbyn. They put out a statement immediately. I think all the big unions except USDOR, which remains, I think, fairly committed to Tony Blair's legacy at the leadership level. They put out another statement yesterday. It was a good statement. It attacks the PLP for having a go at Corbyn. It argues it should stand by the democratic decisions of the party. It did stop short, in my view, of an open endorsement of Corbyn, but they can be a weak link, but it's holding, and that's incredibly important. And it's clear that a number of unions have been quite vociferous in their support for Corbyn. Dave Ward of the Postal Workers CWU, Matt Rack of the firefighters, the Civil Service PCS union, which is not affiliated to Labour, put out a very good statement yesterday defending Corbyn. This is tremendously important. The unions remain a powerful force in the Labour Party. You know, even after the Collins reforms, people remember a couple of years ago, which was just one of a whole, just the latest of a whole number of reforms attempting to dilute the position of the unions. Nonetheless, they still have 50% of the vote at the conference. They still have, for example, just over a third of the national executive comes through the unions of the Labour Party. And once Labour was out of office in 2010, all the corporate funding dried up, and the unions have been the key financial backers of the Labour Party over the last 6 years. Now, we have to understand something about the union leaders. They've often played a highly contradictory role inside the Labour Party. What do they want? They want a Labour Party sympathetic to their interests, not least because that was also a substitute and alternative for the more risky path of strikes and struggle and so on. If they can point to reforms from a Labour government, it's an alibi for not fighting. This is quite important to their interests. Now, at points, they've used their weight in the Labour Party against the left. Probably the most left-wing leader of the Labour Party prior to Corbyn was George Lansbury in the 1930s. Who elbowed him out in the end was Ernest Bevin, the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, and probably the most powerful trade union leader in the interwar period. It was the unions that helped defeat the movement around Nye Bevin in the 1950s. It was the unions that helped launch the witch hunt on the left and the militant in the 1980s. However, at other times, the unions have also been willing to act to stop the Labour Party moving too far to the right, and not acting in their interests or not being sympathetic to their interests. When Ramsay MacDonald pushed through too far his unemployment cuts in 1931, it was the unions that intervened. And more recently, I mean, if you think about things like the winter of discontent in the late 1970s after the pay freeze and the explosion of strikes, the unions swung left, or at least some of them did, and backed Tony Benn, at least temporarily for a couple of years in the early 1980s. I think at the minute they've decided, to back Corbyn, partly because I think they fear that any alternative produced by the parliamentary party will not be sympathetic to the union's interests and be much harder to motivate their members. It's also clear they're under a bit of pressure from their own members. I mean, I was at Unison Conference last week. Corbyn was a speaker. He has gone round union conference after union conference after union conference. He got a standing ovation for walking in the door. It's a bit difficult to row back from that. However, there are dangers here. If at least some of the union leaders start to decide that Corbyn can't get elected, there's a danger they pull back. There's also a danger, and we felt this in the unions, that their argument has really been, wait for 2020, right? And evade the question of struggle. That's the worst way to help Corbyn. The more struggles, the more it strengthens a left-wing feeling in society, the more that makes someone like Corbyn electable. I think there's also dangers that even some of the union leaders think the way forward is to make concessions. The fact that Len McCluskey wrote an article last week talking about the failed experiment of migration from Eastern Europe inside the EU is worrying. It's worrying. It'll strengthen right-wing ideas. It won't strengthen Corbyn. I also think the fact that the Unite conference in 2 weeks' time will see an argument about Trident renewal, where it's quite possible the leadership will help push through a vote essentially legitimising Trident, will be very damaging to Corbyn, especially if we could be in the middle of a leadership campaign around there. To me, it's very significant the union leaders are still backing Corbyn. It strengthens his position. It can't be left to the union leaders. I think we have to take this argument up across the unions that, especially as it now looks probably likely in my view, that there will be a Labour leadership election, that the union should be each union should be openly endorsing Corbyn, campaigning for him, and actually it raises questions about the sponsorship of right-wing MPs who get funding from the union, support from the union, and it actually raises the questions about deselection down the road. This is an argument that cannot be just left to the union leaders. It has to be taken through the organised working class movement. Now, how do we defend Corbyn? It seems to me that the absolute key is mass mobilisation. Mass mobilisation. Like we saw on Monday in Parliament Square. Absolutely fantastic. This will be immeasurably stronger if it's not simply about Corbyn, but is linked to a wider fight that we so desperately need about austerity and racism. So, for example, on the 16th of July, the People's Assembly and Stand Up to Racism have called a demonstration against racism and austerity. The union should be building this. We should see big union delegations. We want to see momentum build it. We have to throw ourselves into building that. Corbyn should address it, should openly identify with this kind of struggle. That's how you shift them. We need more strikes like next week's strike in the schools and some universities. Those strikes should be a focus for mass solidarity with other trade unionists on them. This is what we have to throw ourselves into building. And it goes without saying that has to involve people, whichever way they voted in the EU referendum. If the left makes the question of which way you voted in that, which it's an important debate about how we explain what happened and so on, we'll debate it here at Marxism and discuss it. It cannot be the dividing line. It cannot be the dividing line. We have to unite in the fight against the Tories and austerity. Secondly, inside the Labour Party, there cannot be any more compromise with the Labour right. That is a failed strategy. I mean, I think Hilary Benn should have been sacked when he made that speech over Syria. What? It didn't put us in a stronger position. He had to act decisively. It's quite clear that unity with the Labour right is impossible. It's impossible. There are incompatible forces at play inside the Labour Party. One or the other has to break. If Jeremy Corbyn, I'd be surprised about this, but if Jeremy Corbyn is kept off a ballot paper, if they say he has to get 50 nominations and he can't get them, I think it's unlikely. I think it'd be very foolish. If that was to happen, Corbyn should break, and he should call on other people to break. You can't just hand over the Labour Party to these people. If he wins, I think they can't be going back to trying to find some modus vivendi with these people. They have to be challenged. That means things like deselections. But let's be clear, they will then split. They will then split. That will raise big questions for the union leaders and so on. This is an extremely turbulent and decisive moment. 5 minutes left. Now, the final thing I want to address, I think a lot of people will now say you should join the Labour Party. Matt Rack, who's speaking here at Marxism tomorrow night, who made a very powerful speech in Parliament Square on Monday, said that the strategic battle is inside the Labour Party, you should all join the Labour Party. I don't agree with that. I think the necessity of a revolutionary socialist organisation remains. I want people to reflect on not just the immediate battle, but what are we learning about politics and power in British society? And the question I have is this. If this is how the establishment, let's not be coy, the ruling class, and let's be clear where the loyalties of the Labour right lie with that ruling class, if this is how they act when a socialist is leader of the opposition, imagine how they would act if a socialist government attempted to implement radical policies. I'm not even talking about the expropriation of the bosses, just a challenge to neoliberalism, inequality, and so on. We don't have to imagine, though. We just have to look at Greece a year ago, when Syriza was elected, essentially on an anti-austerity programme. The capitalist class in Greece was too politically weak after years of austerity and attacks and turmoil. It was actually the European ruling class organised through the EU that had to do the heavy lifting of crushing that government and essentially threatening to kill their economy by cutting off the flow of euros to kill the banks. Blackmailing Syriza, who'd won a double mandate, the initial election victory, then that huge Oki referendum, within days forcing them into a reverse somersault. And the truth is, Syriza is now imposing more vicious austerity than even its Tory predecessors, and racist policies with driving refugees back to Turkey. Where does real power lie in society? In the end, it doesn't lie with even the best-intentioned red ministers in Parliament. It lies in the unelected structures of the state machine itself and the corporate boardrooms. In that situation, the need for an independent revolutionary socialist organisation remains vital. It can't be one that stands on the sidelines. We are with Corbyn against the Labour right. In fact, we urge him to go further and harder against these people. There can be no compromise with them. But you have to have a fundamental focus on the struggle of ordinary people, above all in the workplace. That's where working class people gain the confidence to change society. That's where left-wing ideas can begin to get real resonance and traction in that struggle, not in the internal battles inside the Labour Party. An orientation on that struggle, combined with an absolute clarity about where real power lies in society. That's why we still need a revolutionary socialist organisation.
I've got a question, really, something which has been puzzling me, which is why now? Why did the Blairites decide to pounce now, and whether they're doing it from a position of strength or weakness? I've heard a number of ideas about it, none of which seem completely convincing. The first idea is that they were doing it because the left was in a position of weakness, and anybody who's been on Facebook in the last 2 months knows that the sort of talk which is going on, I will never work with those people again, that we're talking about a fairly divided left who might not necessarily be up to the task of defending Corbyn. One thing that we have seen with, as soon as the Blairites have gone on the offensive, that's brought us together. We had a discussion in the pub with someone last night who came into the pub saying those those Lexiters, they've cost us the world, they are to blame for everything. By the middle of the evening, he's ringing up his son, saying, bring all your mates down to the People's Assembly demonstration, we have got to defend Corbyn. And I think the feeling, partly amongst the left, but among much wider layers, people I know who I was at school with, who were just 9 months ago invigorated by Corbyn, have now got something to come together. And so if it was because they think we're in a position of weakness, they've suddenly made us stronger. The other argument which sometimes comes is because of Chilcot. Now, that only works if you take the premise that Mark talked about. They thought they would be able to crush Corbyn within a couple of days. Because what we're now in the situation, we've got Chilcot coming, we've got the teacher strike coming, and the Blairites are not in a position to find a candidate to challenge Corbyn who isn't tainted by all the things that are going to come up with the Chilcot inquiry. Which leads me to ask this question: did they consciously, did they know what they're doing about? Did they consciously choose now to pounce because they thought this is something which they were confident of winning? Is it the least bad opportunity for them, or is what is it? What is why they're doing what they're doing, and what's the strength of our side in stopping them?
Thank you. After the next contributor, can I have the person down there in the black dress?
Good afternoon, comrades. He stole my thunder. The main issue, I'm from Stop the War and Military Families Against War. And my main question is Chilcot. How much has this influenced what's happening right now? From our perspective in Stop the War and Military Families, we think it's a major issue. The second question, why does Corbyn not offer the trade unions to repeal the trade union laws? But truly offer it, really come out strongly. They're two main questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and then after that we'll have the person over there in the green and blue shirt.
Yeah, in terms of, I think, what's driving the coup, I think that, it's correct to say that it's obviously about Blairism. It's about the idea that the reason Tony Blair won a landslide victory in 1992 was suddenly because everyone had become much more right-wing. And so in order to become elected, you need to have a right-wing veneer or just be right-wing through and through. I think that's part of it, but I think it's also actually, for the Blairites, about not just the ability to get elected, but also the ability to govern. And for them, what it means to govern the capitalist state obviously means to make concessions and make compromises with the ruling class. So I think it's not just that they're worried that Corbyn can't get elected. In a way, I think you're right. I think they're worried that he will get elected and refuse to make compromises or concessions with the ruling class. However, that will remains to be seen. I think in terms of the Blairites' interpretation of the Leave vote and of alienation more generally, I think the fact that they interpret it as racism is not just how they read it, but also how they intend to respond to it, because they don't actually intend to offer anything to people to actually respond to the suffering that's going on, and in order to respond to their material needs. If you speak to somebody who says, I can't get a council house, I can't get seen at my doctor's, I can't get a place for my child at my local primary school, you can either say, we're going to build more council houses, we're going to fund the NHS, and we're going to fund education. Or you can say, if you're not planning to do any of those things, which they're clearly not, or you can say, it's because there's too many people on the council house waiting list, there's too many immigrants using the NHS, etc., etc. And I think it's not just how they interpret it, it's not just how they've read it, it's how they're intending to actually respond to it as well. Just quickly, I think that, I don't know what other people think about this, but my view is that if Corbyn manages to win the Labour leadership election, I'm fairly confident that he will, although I wouldn't want to bet on it. But I think, and if he manages to win a general election, my feeling is that Corbyn will probably need to deliver something fairly soon to stop a shift back towards racism and to the right. And it'd be good to know what other people think in terms of what from his programme or what from his policies would he actually be able to deliver. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's you, and then we'll have a person down here in the white shirt.
Well, I'm going to raise a question for Mark, but I think I know the answer already, but I want to share my thoughts with the meeting. Because up and down the country, there must be tens and hundreds of thousands of the people who were behind Corbyn, who are so thoroughly disgusted and incensed, and they'll be talking deselection, as you said. But my question is, how do revolutionary socialists like ourselves relate to those people? And again, I think the answer to that is implicit in what Mark was saying, because it would be all too easy to say to them, look, events just lately have proved what we've been trying to argue all along. You know, the Labour Party has got good people in it, but it's a dead end. There's no parliamentary road to socialism. It's dominated by the trade union bureaucrats, and it'll never change. But I think that would be a gross mistake, because nobody wants to be lectured to. And so the answer to my question, and I'll see if Mark agrees with it, is something else that we've said in our tradition all along, which is that in the day-to-day struggles, wherever they are, it's a hospital, it's a library closure, whatever the hell it is, we prove ourselves to be the most determined, consistent fighters for our class. And I think that's how we draw the people around Momentum to us, and how we attract them towards a more left-wing view of how to go about things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. After the next contributor, it will be the person at the back with the glasses and white shirt.
Yeah, I've just come back from Unison Conference 2, and I was part of the standing ovation as Jeremy Corbyn walked in. I think he needed to feel the love then, and he definitely does now. But, you know, what I wanted to say on a really serious note is the morning of the referendum, we were still down at Unison Conference, and I just think I'm incredibly proud of what the SWP, of which I've been a member for a very long time, how we operated really, because six comrades got up in the morning and spoke on debates about anything just so we could put a political argument which said, please look back and remember what we did 2 or 3 days ago with Jeremy Corbyn. People knew that was coming. We have to get behind Corbyn. And I do think things like that make a massive difference to not letting Dave Prentice, our General Secretary, wriggle out of any support. And also we were really clear in an argument. We had a leaflet first thing that said refugees are welcome, Tories out, general election now. And I think what's been not at all surprising is ever since that morning, the amount of political arguments and debates. I'm glad that people identify me as somebody who might want to talk politics. They should. But I've had all sorts of... I've been confused by some of the texts. People being really upset about Brexit. Somebody wanted... There's apparently a demonstration this weekend about Brexit. I thought the person who texted me and said, are you marching? I thought they were talking about the march against austerity. And I sort of had to explain the stuff that we're thinking on our feet and arguing and developing at the moment, that we want to unite both the Leavers and the Remainers against, Islamophobia, against this and anti-immigration and against racism. And I said to her, we'll have a 10-minute coffee so I can reassure you. The other thing I wanted to say, post-Brexit, at UCH Hospital, where I've been nursing, for the last 20 years or so, our management put out a statement which I think was really, really good, and I wish I could quote it better, I can't, but it more or less said, and it was put out the day of the result, that we want to reassure all our international workers, they didn't use the word international, we want to reassure all the workers from across the world how valuable their contribution is and how important it is, and they want them to feel safe, which I think is brilliant, and that's the sort of thing we have to build on. And I just want to say, finally, haven't got enough time for this, it's a complete bonkers argument to say Jeremy Corbyn's unelectable. He was elected. He was elected, was he not? And by his party, so... I just think we've got a lot of work to do, but people have to also be, well, maybe more subtle than I can be sometimes. But, you know, I can feel that I can win people to the arguments. I'm really proud to be in a party that gives me the ammunition to do so.
Okay, after the next contributor, if there's a woman in the green shirt and glasses.
Sean Doherty, Hackney, and a teacher at City and Islington College. My contribution follows on, I think, from Janet's, because I think we're confronted with quite a complex political situation, and that we have to respond to it in a way that understands those complexities. I've been a revolutionary for 50 years, and this week has been, in many ways, one of the most exciting, but also one of the most challenging weeks that I've experienced. On Tuesday evening, I went to my final union meeting as a worker, and off the top of my head, I said, let's do an emergency resolution in support of Jeremy Corbyn. There were about 25 people at the meeting. I put a resolution which said solidarity with Jeremy. His policies of anti-war, anti-austerity and anti-racism are the policies of our union branch. They're also, as it happens, the policies of our national union, the NUT. Very interesting discussion. I moved it, went to a vote. The rep of my college spoke against it, and the vote was 22-3. 3 people actually voted against it. And I was a little bit taken aback until I went into college the next day, and people are very, very depressed and down because I hadn't been in college since the referendum. I went to one colleague, left-winger, solid. I'm very depressed, I'm very down. Oh, what's the matter? Are you fed up about Jeremy? I don't give a fuck about Jeremy. It's the referendum I'm worried about. My kids are facing racism. Next guy, again, solid, hard left. The trouble with you is, he said, you know, you're too soft on Corbyn. He's not up to it and he has to go. I agree with his politics, but he's just not up to it. Nice guy, but can't deliver. Now, we are going to be faced with those kinds of arguments day in and day out over the next few weeks. And our responsibility, I mean, it's brilliant that Marxism has been timed at the end of this week. We couldn't have done it better in many ways, but we're not here to commentate on events. We are here to do our utmost to shape them. And in trying to shape them, we do face fantastic challenges. And I think it's interesting, Mark talked about the split consciousness or contradictory consciousness of the working class. There's a split consciousness and a contradictory consciousness of many of the lower middle class and professional classes who voted for Remain. They've gone into a kind of meltdown politically, and we have to be very, very clear about how we address that, and we have to address it positively in political terms. And central to that, I mean, it was mentioned earlier on by a couple of the speakers, is mobilising for the demonstration on the 16th and putting the fight against racism at the centre of all of the work that we are doing. If we do that, then not only do we take a principled position on all of the theoretical positions that we are confident about, including the referendum, but that we actually show people a path out of this mess, a path out of this morass. And we say unequivocally that we stand with Corbyn against the right, but not just stand with him, we will mobilise with him against the right, and that's the challenge for our party in the coming weeks.
Okay, thanks. And the next person will be yourself.
Good morning. Afternoon, sorry. I want to speak about mobilisation because I think this is a really important point about how we can start it, continue it and make it happen from the grassroots. I'm a member of Momentum, Lewisham Momentum, and joined when it was first set up to support Jeremy. Since then, and that's a year ago, we've had our membership has increased significantly. We get 100 to 200 people at meetings regularly. We have big political debates and more people are joining, particularly young people. And I think we haven't mentioned that today, but in Lewisham anyway, young people are the foundation of the movement, the mobilisation that's taking place. We've started political education programmes at the CLP level, at the ward level, and Momentum itself, where we have open discussions about issues. And this has never happened in the Labour Party before, in our CLPs anyway. Momentum itself is the national movement is having a series of political education lectures where the first 5 were on Marxism, an introduction to Marxism. And you know how many people came to the first one in South East London? 300 people. And everybody's saying, my goodness, you usually get 3 people in a phone box. And this has moved on and it's growing and growing. So, yes, mobilisation is important, but it must happen at the grassroots level. And we must use political or radical education to engage people in the discussion. Not just preach to them or tell them what they should be doing, but to let them find out the answers for themselves. And young people are the key to this. Thank you very much.
After the next countries, we'll have yourself here in the black top.
Sabir Sagal, Camden SWP. I agree with virtually everything Mark said. I think we are at a very exciting time in British politics, but also potentially a worrying time. We're at a crossroads. I think Mark hit the nail on the head when he talked about, at the beginning of his presentation, polarisation and contradiction. Polarisation, 60% of those who voted supported Corbyn. On the other hand, 3.8 million people voted for UKIP at the last general election. We mustn't forget that, comrades. And they're not all, ex-Tory, lower middle class shopkeepers. A lot of these people were, former Labour voting working class people who've seen their living standards eroded, who are threatened by unemployment, bad housing, can't get an appointment with a GP, etc., etc. But the key remains our ability, and Jeremy Corbyn's ability, to mobilise the working class, to galvanise that potential strength that can pose a real challenge to austerity and to racism. And you see, I agree with Mark what he said very importantly about why the working class voted left in certain years. Let's go back in history. 1945, the khaki election, the working class returns victorious after a fight against fascism. 1966, when Harold Wilson was elected for the second time, the working class had grown strong at the grassroots level through what Tony Cliff used to call the do-it-yourself reformism. 1974, Wilson was re-elected after these 6 years of a fantastic upturn in industrial struggle. When Blair was elected in 1997, that was an anomaly, which we can talk about, but haven't really got time to go into. I remember very clearly what Dennis Healey, a right-wing Labour chancellor, said in 1972 to the Labour Party conference. He says, we will, and don't forget, Dennis Healey was a right-wing chancellor. He said, we will squeeze the rich until the pips squeak. How come a right-wing chancellor makes statements like that? It's because of the movement, the strength of the working class and their ability to fight back. We saw the miners' strike, the engineering strike, the car workers' strikes, and all the rest of it. So today there is a real danger, however. I think the Leave vote is a complex thing. It was partly a wish to kick the establishment, but it was also an expression of fear about immigration. And I don't want to call the people, who voted Leave racists. It's a complex thing. There was a strong, we have to face it, a strong anti-immigrant sentiment for various reasons. We have to face that. But the answer lies, comrades, I think, in our ability to unite with the rest of the left, to unite with Jeremy Corbyn, with people in the Labour Party, and so on, to build a strong grassroots movement that can take on the Tories, that can really halt what I think at the moment is a drift to the right in British politics, to reverse that and move to a left-wing position.
Thanks.
Yes, to support Jeremy Corbyn, and as another comrades have said, to build the demonstration against racism on July the 6th, and to build the SWP, obviously. Thank you.
Okay, after the next countries, we'll have you down there.
Yeah, I'm also a member of Sean's Union Branch Islington NUT. And actually, since Sean put that motion together, first of all, say that, Sean, an SWP member proposed that motion, but a Labour Party member in the room seconded it. And there are a fair number of teachers in our association that have now, since Corbyn joined the Labour Party or rejoined it. So it was a very important thing to do in the association. Now, Islington is a left-wing association, so you would expect, and obviously Corbyn is our MP, one of our two MPs, so you would expect us to support that. But actually, since I put it on Facebook that we had passed that motion, I've been contacted by 5, I think it is, other associations who want to pass a similar motion, and they're not all SWP comrades. Some of them are, but some of them are not. So in actual fact, it's important that we give a lead, that we show practically that we are supporting Corbyn, and that encourages other people to do it. And as Mark mentioned in his introduction, my union will be going on strike on Tuesday. Now, the referendum and all the shenanigans and psychological problems it seems to have caused actually affects inside the union, and there's been a fair amount of discussion, I'd have to say, of people saying, well, is this the right time? The country's in chaos. Should we carry on? Now, but what we have found is that, people are raising these issues, but other people are all, seeing the point. Actually, the Tories are weak. There is chaos. That means that we very much should take action now. It gives us a good fight, a good chance to win the fight. But also, secondly, the point that was made is that if we don't step into the breach, if the organised working class taking action doesn't step into the breach of addressing the problems that working class people have, then that is precisely when they become, more susceptible to right-wing arguments. So we will be striking on Tuesday. Technically, the strike is about, the abolition of our national pay and conditions, and that is a real thing, and we are really worried about that. But of course, every teacher knows that actually the strike is about defending the education system itself. And actually, we also have widespread support from lots of parents and parents groups to do that. So in terms of the practical, if I've still got time, how much have I got time?
You've got 9 seconds.
No, I haven't got time. Just to say that the comrade's question there, why doesn't Corbyn, say that we should, that we should repeal the anti-union laws? Well, he should say it, but I think that's one of the compromises being involved in that kind of Labour Party, and I think that is one of the arguments why we still need an independent revolutionary socialist party as well.
Okay, after the next contributor, we'll have the woman at the back in the red shirt.
Charlie Kimber from Socialist Worker. I think we need to understand that this is an existential crisis for the Labour Party. Things are never going to go back to how they were before. For the immediate reason that if Corbyn wins, I don't see how he then sits down with all those MPs and says, we can forget all about that, can't we? It's impossible. And if he loses, tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people will leave the Labour Party, in my view. So it's a huge moment. And it also, in a more long-term sense, is one of the very few occasions. Remember, the Labour Party is built upon the idea that the MPs are central because you have to achieve change through Parliament, that the MPs are pitted directly against the membership and also the leadership of the Labour Party. This has never happened in this way inside the Labour Party before. My guess is we could see, within weeks, a split in the Labour Party, either of a split on the right greater than that of the Social Democrats of the early 1980s, or a split to the left, producing a Syriza-type organisation. This is how big the stakes are. And we need to recognise that the vast majority of MPs have never accepted Corbyn as leader. People say, why now? The only question was a matter of timing. And it's not just Blairites, by the way. Gordon Brown may be many things. He is not a Blairite. People like Andy Slaughter are many things. They are not Blairites. It includes large sections of the soft left inside the Labour Party as well. And they have never accepted Corbyn. They hoped that the results in May would be bad enough to say, he can never win. They were not bad enough for them to be able to do that. They've seen the potential to knock him out after the fake outrage over the referendum result. And therefore we are unequivocally on the side of Corbyn against the Labour right, unequivocally on the side of Corbyn, but we also say there must be no concessions to the right. No more concessions to the right. One of the earliest concessions that Corbyn made was to say he would head up a Remain campaign in the EU referendum. We can discuss the question, right? He would have been unassailable if he had headed up a left-wing Leave campaign in the election. It would have been Jeremy Corbyn's face on the television, not Nigel Farage's, the day after. And he would have transformed the nature of the campaign as well, particularly amongst young people. And therefore, I think inside the unions, we have to say we need struggle, we need support for the 16th of July demonstration, but also no more money for the traitors. Deselect those who have stabbed Corbyn in the back. Chuck them out. Chuck them out of the Labour Party. We want no more of that. We want a Labour Party that stands up for ordinary people, not that bends to the bosses.
Oh, sorry, I'm really sorry I called this person. But you can go after.
Good afternoon, comrades. I'm kind of, I'm not ashamed to say that I'm a member of Equity and Bet2, but I am a huge Jeremy... Oh, sorry, huge! I don't need a mic. No, I'm a huge Jeremy Corbyn supporter, and I was on Team Corbyn and did lots of phoning with my vocal abilities. But I am disgusted with the way the MPs that he appointed, who have behaved like slimy toads, and I'm disgusted with them. But I do feel that perhaps they shouldn't have been appointed in the first place, but it was sort of trying to unite the Labour Party. And now I think he's got some good people to take over from them, but the press don't even comment on that. And I think also it would be absolutely pathetic if we lost our leader, at least wait till the conference when there's more idea of how everything's panning out because of the referendum. And I feel the referendum just created nasty feelings, hysteria, very badly reported, and the whole campaign against Jeremy Corbyn has been plotted, I think, in Parliament and in... But although the press did try and sort of be fair about it to begin with when they realised how popular he is, and especially then, some people have sort of backtracked. And I just say, I think he's done amazingly to stand firm so far, and he must keep doing that.
Okay, the next contributor will be our last one, and then Mark is going to come back for a few minutes on the discussion.
Comrades, next year I will have been 60 years a revolutionary socialist. I joined the Communist Party. I'm not just saying it for that. What I'm interested in is that I've never been so excited in my life as a result of this election. The only other time I can think of the excitement I had was a docker in 1972 when we were challenging the state and we thought we was heading that way. Unfortunately, the trade union leaderships sort of decided to pull the rug. But on the way here today, I stopped off at a cafe and got involved in a conversation initiated by this woman about Boris Johnson and about the referendum and I was able to express revolutionary politics that, in the past we've been like sleepwalking, if you like, through this whole thing. Suddenly, everybody in the country, just like the Scottish referendum, it's absolutely engulfed everybody in politics. People are out there to be won. We could do it. And we could back Corbyn all the way, and we need that unity. And last night we had a meeting similar to this in Harlow. Not a very big meeting, but what we decided we was going to do, we're going to call a demonstration in Harlow Town Centre, centred around anti-racism, invite all those people who were Remainers, anybody who's interested in a fight against racism, and our sort of slogan will be no to Tory cuts and no to racism. And I think if we combine those two things, we can win people back behind Corbyn, and we can defeat these charlatans, the mafia from bloody Hampstead who've driven us all mad all these years. We've got a real opportunity, so let's get to it.
So I'll pass you back to Mark now.
Okay, thanks, comrades. First of all, I think what Charlie Kimber said is right. You cannot rule out that we could be facing a split inside the Labour Party. So it's definitely going to happen, but these are possibilities. What that would represent, in a sense, is a simple fact, is that, you know, earlier I made the point that very large numbers of people are not revolutionary socialists, but they're committed to reform, to social democracy. They want to see real changes in their lives. Working class people under tremendous pressure. This actually goes back 30 years. This is in turn putting huge pressure on the political structures of British society. The political system can't accommodate that. That's why we're seeing these kind of explosions. We are not just going to go back to what life was like over the last 30 years. We're entering a new phase. And that's going to require constant discussion, constant reorientation, constant political flexibility. These are huge challenges for us. I thought the contribution from the woman who spoke about Lewisham momentum was very, very interesting, very encouraging. You see, I think that people are going through a political journey. After Corbyn was elected, I remember doing a meeting in Southampton, and there was an Italian socialist at the meeting, and he said, you know, where's this come from? Is it that the Labour left has been building up its strength over the decades? And, no. You know, the campaign group of MPs, and I think they had about 11 members, the hard left group traditionally inside the parliament, 11 members, and some of them didn't nominate Corbyn, right? It's not, what you saw was huge new forces rushing into the Labour Party, excited by the idea of change. Many of those forces not in the habit of collective political organisation and so on, quite raw to the struggle, incredibly energetic and enthusiastic. And I think, my impression, I could be wrong, is that at points there's been a slight sense of drift in parts of momentum. You know, it was neither a kind of hard deselection organisation, people like John McDonnell saying, we're not going to do that, at least not now, that may change. But neither was it always consistently focused on wider struggles, although many people were attracted to those. There's a little bit of uncertainty. And it was under pressure. It was Tom Watson that called it a mob and so on. People went out. I mean, one of the mobilisations that Momentum had in London was to go out and campaign for Sadiq Khan. Partly because people understood that if Sadiq Khan hadn't won, they'd have gone for Corbyn then, but also because they were under kind of pressure to prove their Labour Party credentials. I think what people are seeing is that the fight to change the Labour Party is a much tougher battle than simply electing Corbyn as leader. It's a much tougher battle. It's a much misused word, isn't it? But I think we can see a radicalisation taking place amongst many of those people attracted to Corbyn, and many of them will be asking much bigger questions about the nature of social change and the obstacles that are in place to it. And I think the comrade who said, how should revolutionary socialists relate to that? I think he's absolutely right. You don't lecture and dismiss, how you fools, you believed in all of this, and what nonsense. That's a terrible response. Cut yourself off completely. It is absolutely to be shoulder-to-shoulder people, showing that you're one of the best fighters over opposing racism, opposing cuts, and so on, and we take sides with Corbyn. You know, revolutionary socialists are not neutral, if you want to put it in these terms, in the battle between right-wing versions of reformism that offer very little and left-wing versions that do talk about social. We take sides. We understand it would be a defeat. It would create huge pessimism and so on if Corbyn's just pushed out without a fight. This is crucial. We are unequivocally with Corbyn, and we are not for any compromises, right? Alongside that, though, I do think there's an opening up amongst large numbers of people who want to talk about how do you change society, how do you change the Labour Party, can you change the Labour Party, what's the way forward? And I think we have to rise to the level of that conversation with large numbers of people. We won't convince all of them right now, but these are crucial arguments. The first thing is to act, and not just speculate. We are not, you know, it's a good turnout today, right? But we're not hundreds of thousands, but we are a factor in this. We are a factor that can try and shape. You know, you can't just speculate. It's very easy, isn't it? It's very, it's very absorbing. You have to constantly try to act and intervene and shape the struggle. Last couple of points. See, I think when Sabi Segal said, you know, it's a highly contradictory situation, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's sometimes difficult to hold on to all the elements of the contradiction, though, because I don't actually think it's right simply to say Britain is drifting to the right. I think it's much more contradictory than that, complex than that. We have Farage. I don't know if people saw the poll that said that one of the countries around the world that's most sympathetic to refugees was Britain, in Europe, sorry. You have both sides of the equation. And I'll just end with this. It's in danger of becoming a cliche, but the poet W.B. Yeats, in the middle of the Irish Revolution in 1919, wrote a poem that has the lines, "The centre cannot hold, things fall apart." That's a little bit too strong for describing where we're at in British society at the minute. But the 30, 40 years of neoliberal assaults on the working class have created deep pools of bitterness that are in turn putting pressure on the structures of liberal democracy and the old forms of ruling class dominance. The centre is fraying, it's eroding, and this is accelerating. We are facing repeated political upheavals and convulsions. The rise of a right-wing populist party outside the Tory party, UKIP, it's a new phenomenon in British society over the last century, in reality. The sudden way in which the Scottish referendum almost split up the British state and became a focus for a huge anti-establishment, anti-war, anti-austerity mood. The sudden development of Corbyn as Labour leader from nowhere. I didn't see it coming. The huge solidarity with refugees, the highly contradictory and explosive nature of what we've just seen in the European referendum. There are going to be more convulsions, more upheavals. The challenge facing the left is this. When the centre is beginning to fray, does the left see its task as to try to rebuild the centre and to prop it up because things are messy and complicated and dangerous and so on? And really, if we start to mess around with the social structures, won't there just be an eruption of racism that's just below the surface? Or do we accept that, yes, it's messy, yes, it's contradictory, what political upheaval isn't? But the task of the left, and it's easier to say than do, it's an immense challenge, but the task of the left that we have to try to address is to try to channel that immense bitterness in society into class directions that challenge the powerful rather than scapegoating the powerless. That's, if we just do the first, just try to rebuild the centre, it's an absolute disaster that will cut us off from that rage and bitterness and hand it over to political adventurers and demagogues and so on, even from within the ruling class. Our task is to relate to that bitterness, challenge its weakest, most reactionary elements, develop all that's progressive and right about it into a furious assault on the privileges of the powerful and the rich.